The late afternoon sun didn't just shine on Willow Creek. It beat down, punishing every plank of wood and every soul dumb enough to be standing in the street. In the middle of that dusty road, a crowd had gathered, buzzing like flies on a corpse. They were gathered around a wooden platform, and on that platform stood a girl, or what was left of one. She was chained at the wrists, her dress torn, dried blood cracking at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were on fire. They burned through the crowd, daring anyone, everyone, to take one more step. Samuel Hayes stood at the edge of it all. He was a big man, quiet, the kind you don't mess with. He'd come to town for flour and salt, not for a spectacle, but he couldn't look away, not from her. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Pritchard, raised a gavel. "What we have here, gentlemen," he shouted, "is a genuine wild creature, found in the canyons, fighting like a demon. Took 6 deputies to bring her in." Laughter rolled through the men. "What's her name?" someone yelled. "Elena," Pritchard sneered. "Or so she says. The county's washing its hands of her. Whoever takes her at his own risk." That's when she turned. Her fiery gaze swept over the leering faces until it landed on Samuel. The whole world seemed to go silent. It wasn't recognition. It was a challenge, a spark in the gunpowder dry air. Before anyone could speak, her voice cut through the heat like a whip. "I ain't no horse," she snapped, her chin held high, "and I'll kill any man who tries to break me." A gasp went through the crowd. This was better than a hanging. Bull Morrison, a rancher with a face like a rotten tomato, shoved his way to the front. $40, he bellowed. "She'll look fine next to my spirited fillies." Elena spat right at his boots. A deputy backhanded her across the face. She stumbled but didn't fall. Her eyes never left Bull's. They promised murder. Samuel's hand clenched into a fist. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to get involved. He had his own ghosts, his own past he was trying to outrun. But something inside him, something he thought he'd buried a long, long time ago, refused to stay quiet. He took a heavy step forward. The crowd parted. 100, Samuel said. His voice was calm, but it hit the square like a thunderclap. Pritchard's eyes bulged. Even Bull Morrison looked stunned. $100? Hayes, you can't be serious. Samuel didn't answer. He just pulled a heavy leather pouch from his coat and let it drop onto the platform with a solid, final thud. Bull Morrison's face went from red to purple. "Now hold on, Hayes." Samuel turned those steel-gray eyes on him. "Unless you got more," he said, his hand hovering just an inch from the Colt at his hip. "She's mine." Bull knew that look. Everyone in the territory knew that look. He sputtered, cursed, and then spat on the ground. "She's all yours," he snarled, "but you'll never tame her. No man will." A deputy unlocked the chains. They fell to the wood with a clatter that sounded like freedom. Elena rubbed her raw wrists, but her eyes were locked on Samuel. She stood there, a wolf deciding whether to bite the hand that freed it or run for the hills. "You bought nothing," she told him, her voice cold as a grave. "I'm no man's property." "Never said you were," Samuel replied, his voice low. "But right now, getting you away from this lot is the best of 2 bad choices. You come peaceful, or I leave you to them." Her jaw tightened. Pride warred with instinct. She gave a sharp, angry nod. "I'll come," she said, "but I won't kneel. Not for you. Not for anyone." "Never asked you to," he said, and turned to lead her away. They rode out of town as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. Their shadows stretched long and twisted behind them. 2 strangers tied together by $100 in a cloud of dust. Elena rode the mare he'd given her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the desert. She hadn't said a word since they left Willow Creek. Samuel didn't push it. He knew you didn't buy trust with coin. Some things had no price. As darkness fell, the coyotes began their lonely calls. Samuel led them to a small grove of cottonwoods nestled around a hidden spring. It was a place he knew, a place that was safe. He swung down from his horse and began gathering wood for a fire, deliberately turning his back to her. It was a test, an invitation. "This ground's safe," he said. his voice carrying in the still night air. Water's clean. We'll rest here. She sat frozen on the mare, watching him, her mind racing. This was her chance. He was distracted. She could spur the horse, vanish into the blackness, and be gone forever. He must have read her mind. If you keep riding, he said, not even looking at her, that's your choice. But push that mare too hard in the dark, and you'll both end up buzzard feed by morning. He knelt, striking a flint. A small spark grew into a flickering flame, casting dancing shadows against the rocks. He gave her every opportunity to run. He was practically daring her to do it. But as the fire crackled to life, he heard the soft thud of her boots hitting the ground. She hadn't run. Just for tonight, she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel nodded once, feeding a dry branch into the flames. He didn't smile, but deep inside, something cold and dormant had started to thaw. He'd just gambled everything on a ghost, and now that ghost was sitting by his fire. The ranch, Triple Creek, was a world away from the canyons she knew. It was a sprawling piece of land carved out of the wilderness, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. For Elena, it was just a bigger cage. She moved through the days like a phantom, her eyes missing nothing, her mouth saying little. She worked from before dawn until after dusk, hauling water, mending fences, her small frame powered by a furious, stubborn energy. She was determined to prove she was a debt paid, not a burden. Samuel gave her space. He watched from a distance, a silent guardian she refused to acknowledge. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the dusty corral, hers full of fire and suspicion, his holding nothing but a deep, unreadable patience. The ranch hands kept their distance. Tom, the old foreman, treated her like an unexploded bomb. Young Billy stared with wide-eyed fascination until Tom smacked him on the head and told him it was safer to stare at a rattlesnake. Only Miguel, the oldest hand, with a face like a wrinkled map of the territory, treated her with a gentle kindness. He offered her coffee in the morning and never asked questions she didn't want to answer. Slowly, cautiously, she began to speak to him. Just a few words at a time. Questions about the horses, the weather, the land. One evening, Samuel found her by the corral, her hand on the neck of a wild mustang that even Tom couldn't get near. The horse, usually a bundle of panicked muscle, stood perfectly still, calm under her touch. It was like she was whispering a secret language only it could understand. Samuel leaned on the fence beside her. "You've got away with them," he said quietly. She stiffened, pulling her hand back. "They're honest," she shot back. "They fear or they trust, nothing in between." "Wish people were that simple," Samuel said, his eyes on the horse. Her gaze flickered to him, sharp and piercing. "People always want something," she said, her voice laced with the bitterness of experience. "That's why I survived alone." He didn't argue. Instead, he did something that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached over, unlatched the corral gate, and swung it wide open. He was letting the wild mustang go. The horse could bolt, run for the hills, and $1,000 of ranch profit would disappear with it. Elena stared, her mind reeling, but the horse didn't run. It took a few steps out, circled once, and then calmly walked back into the corral to join the others. Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Sometimes," he said, his voice just a low rumble, "what you expect isn't what you get." That night, for the first time, Elena took a seat at the long supper table with the men. She didn't speak. She just ate. But it was a start, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing, and it was about to be shattered. One afternoon, Miguel was helping Elena reshoe the mare Samuel had given her. She was stroking the horse's neck, calming it with low whispers, when Miguel suddenly froze. His eyes were fixed on her arm, where her sleeve had written up. "Madre de Dios," he whispered, his face going pale. On the underside of her forearm, faint and faded with time but still unmistakable, was a small, intricate brand. A crescent moon over a running horse. Elena yanked her sleeve down, her eyes flashing with a familiar, cornered animal fear. "It's nothing," she snapped, but it was too late. Miguel had seen it, and he knew exactly what it was. That night, long after the others were asleep, Miguel found Samuel on the porch, staring out into the darkness. Boss, Miguel said, his voice low and heavy. We need to talk about the girl. Samuel didn't turn. What about her? The brand on her arm, Miguel said. I've seen it before. A long time ago. He paused, taking a deep breath. That's the mark of the Marchetti family. Samuel was silent, but Miguel could see the tension in his shoulders. The Marchettis were horse masters, Miguel continued, his voice full of a kind of reverence. They could tame any creature, they said. Their horses were like wind and fire. They were legends, but they were all killed, slaughtered in a raid 10 years back. Everyone, the whole family wiped out. He finally looked at Samuel, his old eyes searching the rancher's face. No one survived that night, boss. So you tell me, how is that girl wearing their mark? Samuel took a long, slow breath, the sound loud in the night. He looked over at Miguel, and for the first time, the old ranch hand saw something in his boss's eyes besides patience. It was a deep, haunted pain, a secret he had carried for a decade. Because, Miguel, Samuel said, his voice rough with a terrible truth, one of them did survive. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than any storm cloud. Elena wasn't just some wild girl found in the canyons. She was Elena Marchetti, the last of a murdered bloodline, a ghost who was supposed to be dead, and Samuel had known it all along. He'd known it from the moment he saw her on that auction block. His $100 purchase wasn't an act of charity, it was an act of penance. The world at Triple Creek shifted on its axis. The men looked at Elena differently now, with a mixture of awe and fear. She was no longer just a stray Samuel had brought home. She was a living legend, the heir to a tragic legacy. And she was a target. The truth of her past explains so much. Her almost supernatural connection to horses, the haunted look in her eyes, the fierce, unyielding will to survive. She carried the ghosts of her family with her every single day. Samuel watched her, his own guilt a constant bitter taste in his mouth. He remembered that night 10 years ago. He'd been a young Texas Ranger then, part of a squad tasked with keeping the peace. They'd been paid off, ordered to take the long route to the Marchetti estate by a corrupt captain. By the time they arrived, it was too late. The ranch was a slaughterhouse, smoke and the smell of death choking the air. He saw it all, the bodies, the blood, and then a flicker of movement at the edge of the canyon. A small girl with hair like fire, scrambling into the rocks, disappearing like a phantom. He'd wanted to go after her, to help her, but his captain had forbidden it. Leave her, or the man had said. She's buzzard feed now. The job is done. The guilt from that order had eaten away at Samuel for a decade, driving him out of the Rangers and into a life of self-imposed exile at Triple Creek, until the day he walked into Willow Creek and saw a ghost on an auction block. He hadn't bought a woman. He had found his last chance at redemption. Life settled into a tense routine. Elena, aware that her secret was out, retreated even further into herself. She spent her days with the horses, the only creatures she truly trusted. She began breaking the wild mustangs, using not force but a quiet patience that left the other ranch hands speechless. She was turning Triple Creek's herd into the finest in the territory, each horse a testament to the blood that ran in her veins. One afternoon, a dust cloud on the horizon announced a visitor. It wasn't a posse, just a lone rider leading a pack mule, an old traveling merchant named Silas. He took one look at Elena as she crossed the yard, and his jaw dropped. He fumbled in his saddlebag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A charcoal sketch of a man with kind eyes and a wide smile, a beautiful woman with long dark hair, and two little girls. One of them had fiery auburn hair and defiant eyes. It was Elena. I knew your father, Carlo, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. He was a good man, the best horseman I ever knew. He told them stories of the Marchetti Ranch, a place of laughter and music, filled with the most magnificent horses the world had ever seen. And then his face darkened. I was in the next county when it happened, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Word was, it wasn't just bandits. It was a land grab. I heard whispers. Whispers that a man named Bull Morrison was seen riding away from the smoke that day. The name hit the porch like a physical blow. Bull Morrison, the man who had tried to buy her, the man whose bloated face sneered at her from the crowd. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. He hadn't just wanted to buy a wild girl for $40. He had recognized her. He was trying to buy the silence of the only witness to his decade-old crime. He wasn't just a bully. He was a murderer. And he had tried to own the last living person who could see him hang. That night, the sky broke open. A furious storm descended on the valley, a mirror of the turmoil at the ranch. Wind howled and rain came down in sheets, turning the dry earth to mud. In the chaos, a section of fence by the creek broke, and a dozen horses, panicked by the thunder, bolted into the raging storm. Without a second thought, Elena was on her mare, chasing after them into the blinding rain. Samuel and the others followed, but she was faster, more fearless, a part of the storm itself. By the time Samuel found her, hours later, she was soaked and shivering, crouched against a rock face, her arms wrapped around herself. She had managed to round up most of the horses, but the storm had broken something in her. The terror in her eyes wasn't from the lightning. It was from a memory. He pulled her to her feet, wrapping his heavy coat around her trembling shoulders. "You'll kill yourself running like that," he said, his voice rough with concern. "I didn't ask you to come for me," she snapped through chattering teeth. "You didn't have to," he replied, his voice softening. "We look out for our own here." Back in the main house, he tended to her cuts and scrapes with gentle hands. She didn't fight him. For once, she just sat still, staring into the fire with haunted, empty eyes. "It was a night like this," she whispered, her voice so low he could barely hear it. "The thunder. It sounded just like the gunshots." She finally looked at him, her defenses washed away by the storm. "I thought I knew how to survive alone," she said, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "But I don't know anything." "You know how to survive," Samuel said softly, his own voice tight with emotion. "Now you're learning how to live." And just as the words left his mouth, they heard it. Over the dying howl of the wind, another sound. The unmistakable rhythmic thunder of dozens of horses riding hard for the ranch. They weren't coming for the cattle. They were coming for her. The attack came with the first light of dawn. It wasn't just a posse, it was a small army. 15 men led by Jake Morrison, Bull's younger, meaner brother. They thundered into the yard, torches held high, their faces twisted with hate. "Hayes!" Jake screamed, his voice a venomous rasp. "We know who you're hiding! Send out the Marchetti girl, or we'll burn this place to the ground!" Samuel stepped onto the porch, his rifle in his hand. Tom, Miguel, and even young Billy were right behind him, armed and ready. 5 against 15. The odds were impossible. But before Samuel could speak, Elena stepped through the doorway. She wasn't holding a rifle. In her hand, she held a long, wicked-looking skinning knife. The fire from the torches glinted off the steel. "I am Elena Marchetti," she called out, her voice ringing across the yard, clear and strong as a bell. "And I won't be anyone's prize. You want me? You'll have to kill me first." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Jake Morrison's men shifted uneasily. This wasn't the scared, captive girl they'd expected. This was something else entirely. "She's not yours," Samuel's voice cut through the tension, cold and deadly. "She's not mine. She is her own. But while she's on this land, she's under my protection. You come for her, you come through me." Jake Morrison laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Protection? You couldn't protect her family, Hayes. What makes you think you can protect her now?" The words were a gut punch. How did he know? How could he possibly know Samuel was there that night? Elena's head whipped around, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrible betrayal. She stared at Samuel, the man who had saved her, the man who had shown her kindness, and saw him in a new, horrifying light. He hadn't just known who she was. He had been there. He had watched her family die. The world tilted, the yard dissolving into a blur of confusion and rage. Jake's words had been a bullet aimed not at Samuel, but at her. He had shattered the fragile trust that had been building between them, turning her savior into a potential accomplice. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fury that eclipsed everything else. You were there. Elena, it's not what you think, Samuel started, taking a step toward her. Don't touch me, she shrieked, the knife flashing in her hand. The Morrisons watched, their grins widening. This was better than they could have hoped. They didn't need to fight. They could just watch Triple Creek tear itself apart from the inside. Fire the barn, Jake roared, seizing the moment. A torch arced through the air, landing on the dry roof of the hayloft. Flames erupted, licking at the dark sky. The attack had begun. The fight was chaos. Gunfire exploded, shattering the morning stillness. It wasn't a standoff. It was a war. Samuel and his men were good, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Miguel went down, a bullet in his leg. Billy fought with the frantic courage of a boy trying to be a man. Through it all, Elena was a whirlwind of fury. She moved with a speed and grace that was terrifying, her knife a silver blur in the firelight. She wasn't just defending herself, she was avenging her family. She disabled two of Morrison's men before they even knew what was happening, not killing, but crippling, her movements precise and deadly. But they were losing. The fire was spreading, and their ammunition was running low. Just as one of Morrison's thugs cornered Billy, ready to deliver the final blow, a shot rang out from an impossible angle. The man dropped. Everyone froze, looking toward the rocky ridge overlooking the ranch. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the rising sun, a long rifle in hand. It was a woman. Another shot, and one of Jake's men cried out, clutching his shoulder. Panic began to spread through the attackers. Who was this phantom shooter? Where did she come from? Jake Morrison, his face a mask of rage and confusion, screamed at his men to fall back. They scrambled for their horses, dragging their wounded with them, and fled, leaving the burning barn and the stunned defenders behind. As the last of the hoofbeats faded into the distance, the figure on the ridge began to make her way down. Elena watched, her heart pounding in her chest, the knife still clutched in her hand. The woman who walked out of the morning mist was older, her face etched with hardship, but there was no mistaking the fiery hair, the defiant set of her jaw. It was her sister, Rosa, alive. The reunion was a storm of tears and choked out words, two halves of a shattered family clinging to each other in the ruins of the ranch yard. Rosa, who Elena had seen cut down, had survived. She'd been wounded and left for dead, later found by a group of prospectors who had nursed her back to health. She had spent 10 years believing she was the only one left, living a quiet, hidden life in the mountains. She'd only heard rumors of a wild girl who looked like her a week ago and had been tracking her ever since, arriving just in time to turn the tide of the battle. But the miraculous return was overshadowed by a dark, unavoidable truth. As Rosa's story tumbled out, Elena's eyes kept straying to Samuel. He stood apart from the others, his face grim, the smoke from the burning barn coiling around him like a shroud. The battle was over, but the real war was just beginning. He was there, Rosa, Elena said, her voice flat and dead. He watched them die. Rosa looked from her sister's anguished face to the silent rancher. She saw the guilt etched into every line on his face. The story came out then, torn from Samuel in ragged, painful chunks. He told them everything, about being a young ranger, about the corrupt captain and the deliberate delay, about arriving to find the massacre. He told them how he saw a small girl with hair like fire vanish into the rocks, and how the order to leave her behind had haunted every day of his life since. I never stopped looking, he said, his voice raw. Every time I heard a story about a wild girl in the canyons, I followed it. For 10 years, when I saw you on that platform in Willow Creek, it was like seeing a ghost. It was my one chance to try and make it right. Elena's heart was a knot of ice. The kindness he had shown her, the patience, the protection. Was it all just for him? A way to quiet his own demons? So you didn't save me, she said, her voice trembling with rage. You were just easing your conscience. It started that way, he admitted, his gaze unflinching, but it's not that way now. Before she could respond, Miguel, propped up against a wagon wheel, spoke up, his voice weak but firm. The Morrisons won't stop, he rasped. They know who you both are now. They know you're witnesses. They won't just ride away. They'll come back with the law on their side. He was right. Jake Morrison wasn't just a thug, he was cunning. He would twist the story, paint Samuel and his people as criminals, and use the bought and paid for town sheriff to finish the job he started. They had won the battle, but the Morrisons controlled the board. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. There was only one path left. "We go to them," Elena said, her voice suddenly clear and cold as steel. Her eyes met Samuel's, not with forgiveness, but with a new, terrifying resolve. "We don't wait for them to bring the law. We bring the truth. We go back to Willow Creek and we burn the Morrisons to the ground, not with fire, but with their own sins." Rosa stood by her side, her rifle held firm. The ranch hands, wounded and weary, nodded in agreement. This was no longer just about Elena. The Morrisons had attacked their home, their family. Samuel looked at the woman he had spent a decade searching for. She was no longer a victim to be saved. She was a warrior, a leader. He had failed to protect her family, but he would not fail her. "I'll ride with you," he said simply. Their alliance was broken and reforged in the same fire, no longer built on secrets and guilt, but on a shared, burning need for justice. Willow Creek was a powder keg waiting for a spark. By the time Samuel, Elena, Rosa, and the wounded ranch hands arrived, the town was already buzzing. Jake Morrison had been busy. He told the sheriff a wild tale of being ambushed by a notorious bandit, Elena Marchetti, and her gang of outlaws led by the crazed rancher Samuel Hayes. He painted himself as the victim, a concerned citizen trying to bring a dangerous criminal to justice. The town, fueled by fear and ignorance, bought it completely. A crowd gathered as they were brought before Judge Cornelius Blackwood, the same man who presided over the territory with a firm but supposedly fair hand. The hearing was held in the town's largest barn, the place packed to the rafters with angry, fearful townspeople. Bull and Jake Morrison stood at the front, looking smug and righteous. The sheriff stood beside them, his hand resting on his gun, a clear sign of where his loyalties lay. It was a trap, a public execution of their reputations, soon to be followed by a literal one. The judge, a man with cold, calculating eyes, called the hearing to order. Jake Morrison stepped forward and delivered a masterful performance, weaving a story of Elena's supposed crimes, of her violent nature, of the danger she posed to their peaceful community. He had paid witnesses, cowed and terrified, who mumbled agreements to his lies. It was hopeless. The crowd was turning on them, their murmurs growing into angry shouts. The judge looked ready to deliver his verdict. Then Elena stepped forward. She wore a simple, clean dress, her hair brushed back, but the fire in her eyes could have lit the barn ablaze. She didn't speak to the judge. She spoke to the crowd. "My name is Elena Marchetti," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the barn. "And this man," she pointed a trembling finger at Bull Morrison, "murdered my family." A gasp rippled through the barn. Bull Morrison blustered, calling her a liar, a madwoman. But Elena continued, her voice rising with passion and grief. She told them everything, about her family, about the massacre, about the 10 years she spent surviving alone. She laid bare the truth of her life, her pain a raw, undeniable force in the room. The crowd grew quiet, the anger in their eyes being replaced by confusion, then by dawning horror. This wasn't the monster Jake Morrison had described. This was a survivor. Samuel stepped forward next. He corroborated her story, and then he dropped his own bombshell. "I was a Texas Ranger," he announced, stunning the crowd into silence. "And I was there that night. I was part of the patrol that was paid to let Bull Morrison commit mass murder." He confessed his own failure, his own guilt, his own part in the conspiracy of silence that had protected the Morrisons for a decade. He laid his own soul bare for the town to see. The barn was silent as a tomb. The Morrisons were sputtering, their lies unraveling thread by thread. Judge Blackwood, his face pale, banged his gavel, trying to regain control. "These are baseless accusations, hearsay and fantasy," he declared, his voice a little too loud, a little too shrill. It was clear then. The judge was in on it. He was part of the corruption, another man on the Morrison payroll. He was about to dismiss the case, to sentence them all, when a voice came from the back of the barn. "It's not a fantasy," It's the truth. A man pushed his way through the crowd. It was the deputy, the same young, scared deputy who had struck Elena at the auction. His face was streaked with tears, his hands trembling. I was there too, he choked out, looking at Samuel. I was a rookie, just a kid. I followed orders, but I can't live with it anymore. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, oilskin wrapped package. He unwrapped it carefully and held up what was inside. It was a single bloody glove, made of fine leather, and on the cuff, clear as day, was the Morrison cattle brand. I found it by the main house, the deputy said, his voice shaking but strong. I kept it all these years. I was too afraid to come forward. The glove was the spark. The barn exploded. The carefully constructed world of the Morrison brothers came crashing down in a single, defining moment. Justice, it turned out, hadn't been in the judge's hands. It had been hiding in a guilty man's pocket for 10 years. Chaos erupted. The crowd turned on the Morrisons, their fear replaced by a righteous mob fury. Bull and Jake, their faces masks of panicked disbelief, went for their guns. They were not going to be taken alive. But they had forgotten about Rosa. From her position near the barn door, she raised her rifle. A single shot, and Jake's gun went flying from his hand. Samuel, moving with the speed of a ranger, tackled Bull to the ground. The fight was short and brutal. The townspeople themselves subdued the Morrison's men. The corrupt sheriff, seeing which way the wind was blowing, was the first to clap the irons on his former employers. Judge Blackwood tried to slip away in the confusion, but he was stopped by Mrs. Carlson, the respected ranch wife, and a half-dozen other women from the town who formed a silent, unbreachable wall until he could be arrested. Justice had come to Willow Creek, swift, brutal, and undeniable. In the quiet aftermath, as the Morrisons were dragged away in chains, Elena and Samuel stood in the middle of the barn, the dust settling around them. The truth was finally out. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and the villains had been brought to justice. He looked at her, not as a broken thing he needed to fix, or a sin he needed to atone for, but as the incredible, unbreakable woman she was. Elena, he started, his voice thick with a decade of unspoken words. She stopped him by gently touching the old scar on his arm, the one she had given him on their first night together. No words were needed. It was forgiveness. It was understanding. It was a new beginning. Months turned into a year. Triple Creek Ranch was rebuilt, stronger than before. With Rosa there, the place felt like a home for the first time. A sanctuary built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring it. The Marchetti legacy was reborn, not in a grand estate, but in the quiet strength of two sisters and the family they had forged in fire and blood. One winter, a blizzard swept through the valley, trapping Samuel in the high country while he was checking on the herd. He was gone for 2 days. When the storm finally broke, Elena rode out alone into the blinding white, following an instinct, a connection that went deeper than words. She found him half frozen in a snowdrift, his horse dead beside him, and dragged him back from the edge of death. As he lay recovering by the fire, his body weak but his eyes clear, he took her hand. "Marry me, Elena Marchetti," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Not to tame you, not to cage you, but to stand beside you, always." Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. "I'll keep my knives," she warned, a hint of the old fire returning. He gave a rough, weak laugh. "I'd worry if you didn't." They were married in the spring, under the shade of the old cottonwoods by the spring, where they had spent their first night. The whole ranch was there. Elena didn't wear a fancy dress, but she wore her mother's silver cross, and she held Rosa's hand until Samuel took it in his. Elena Hayes never stopped being wild. She rode with the wind in her hair and ruled the ranch with a fierce love that was as untamed as the Arizona sky. Her wildness wasn't a curse to be broken. It was the fire that had kept her alive, the fire that had brought a corrupt town to its knees, and the fire that had warmed the cold, empty heart of a lonely rancher. The folks in town stopped calling her the wild girl. They called her the Marchetti Miracle, a woman who had walked out of a massacre right into a legend. What an incredible journey of survival and justice. If you were moved by Elena's story, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe because there are always more strange, dark, and mysterious stories to tell.